Italy's Prime Minister is a puzzle. He sees himself as Moses, but acts like Machiavelli. He worships democracy, yet sucks its blood. He's a mass of contradictions.
He is a genius because he understands what normal people want.
Mr. Berlusconi has such a big self-esteem that he thinks that he can avoid any kind of regulations. He can promise it and not deliver it. He's a king, not a prime minister.
When you have one man who directly controls still the three major commercial channels, then we're in deep water in terms of the relationship in a democracy between media and politics.
Noi vogliamo rendere spaziosa e sicura per il nostro popolo, per la maggioranza degli italiani, la strada della libertà. Viva l'Italia, viva la libertà!
A tycoon, a business titan who became Prime Minister. Silvio Berlusconi charms and bends the rules. Yet his is the face of today's Italian politics. He is exceptional, a phenomenon, having risen from next to nothing to huge wealth and power. He's also been dubbed by Britain's Economist as a man unfit to rule. The magazine is not alone in questioning his business methods, the origins of his fortune, and his persisting conflict of interests. He is still learning about politics, often the hard way. When Italy assumed the rotating presidency of the European Union, Mr. Berlusconi found himself centre stage at the European Parliament in Strasbourg. It all began amicably. He delivered a heavyweight speech about Europe's current priorities and then displayed his gift for the gaffe. A German MEP asked him if he'd given himself immunity in Italy to sidestep bribery charges. Mr. Berlusconi flipped.
Signor Schulz, so che in Italia c'è un produttore che sta montando un film sui campi di concentramento nazisti. La suggerirò per il ruolo di Capò.
Italians are used to his verbal infelicities, but shock horror, this was the international stage. Europe was not amused. His own deputy sat wooden-faced.
Dentro Berlusconi che convivono due anime. La prima anima è quella di un politico democristiano, come diciamo nel nostro paese, cioè un uomo di centro, moderato, che vorrebbe stare al centro del sistema solare politico e distribuire le aree di influenza a tutti gli altri, governare in qualche modo col consenso, senza rotture sociali, nel dialogo coi sindacati. L'altra anima di Berlusconi è un'anima fortemente radicale di destra, populista, un'anima, potremmo dire, tra virgolette, rivoluzionaria, così come è stato rivoluzionario Ronald Reagan negli Stati Uniti o Margaret Thatcher in Gran Bretagna.
Europe's press had a field day. For Berlusconi, it was just a jibe, but the business tycoon turned Prime Minister has yet to learn about diplomacy, and Chancellor Schröder was offended.
There's been a great deal of attention paid to his reply to the German Social Democrat Schulz, but very little attention to what Schulz was actually saying. And Schulz was actually making a very important point about enlarged European powers, in particular enlarged judicial powers, so that you could get a European warrant of arrest for anybody in Europe. This is the last thing that Silvio Berlusconi wants.
So who is he, this maverick statesman? Berlusconi comes from Milan, the powerhouse of northern Italy, and the country's business capital, a city of finance, fashion and media, dynamic and creative. Milan is about image and entrepreneurs. No surprise at all that this city gave birth to Silvio Berlusconi.
The character of Milan is to be confident. This is in a certain sense, a New York mentality. And also don't forget, even in politics, in Milan, everything started. Every important thing in our 100 years of political life, don't forget also fascism was born here. This is not a good example. But the center-left was born here. All the important change in politics were started in Milan.
Berlusconi was born in 1936 in the age of Mussolini, the son of a bank clerk who rose to management. It was in his teenage years that Silvio began to blossom. The boy had a talent for music, and he formed a band with a school friend, Fedele Confalonieri. What's more, like this singer, he was good-looking, loved the microphone, and clearly enjoyed the limelight.
He was a sort of crooner. The repertory at that time was French song, Frank Sinatra, Nat King Cole, Bing Crosby. At that time there wasn't television. You had to have fun with the parties, and also it was a way to know some girls, to have a starting point a little advanced. It was also very charming, also with girls.
Silvio was always a charmer.
He was handsome, so to say, one of the most handsome boys of the class.
But even at school, he'd had a precocious eye for business.
He was convincing a number of classmates of selling vacuum cleaner electrical brushes. This is an indication of his capability of organizing teams and leading the teams as well.
And making money.
And making money, yes.
After getting a first-class degree at Milan University, Berlusconi went into the world of property. This is where he made his first real money. He was soon on the way to becoming a millionaire, and his old school friend became a lifelong business partner.
When he was 30, more or less 30, he projected a new town, Milano 2, and of course he earned a lot of money.
Milano 2, Milan 2, was a whole upmarket garden city. But critics now ask, where had Berlusconi found £10 million to finance the project in the first place? In the 1990s, there were to be serious legal investigations into his holding company, Fininvest.
When he sold Milano 2, his earning his profit was 35 billion lire, 30 years ago. So when I read something about mafia that financed the beginning of television, it's only ridiculous, but it's also worrying you. You could be, let me say a vulgar thing, pissed off about that, because this is something shameful. Because it's shameful, because it's really not true.
Mr. Berlusconi now turned to television. He'd already set up an internal cable TV system in Milano 2. Public broadcasting was still the prerogative of state TV RAI. But when Italian rules changed to allow local broadcasting, Berlusconi found a loophole. He bought up local stations around Italy, plying them with video cassettes of programs, which they then screened at roughly the same time. It was indistinguishable from a national network. It was all the brilliant footwork of an entrepreneur with friends in high places. Mr. Berlusconi's brand of TV was new, brash and glitzy.
The state-owned television at that time was very grey. One of the key words was austerity. So the great idea was to be more American. The American way of life, the American style of life, the American dream is to be rich, to consume, to be happy. This was the great novelty.
It quickly became a bit of a Wild West environment. There were hundreds of independent private local stations, and it was anything goes. Soft porn became part of the package on late-night shows. But Berlusconi decided that real money was to be made with family entertainment. Enough of this, he said. His girls were to keep their clothes on. He was ready now to challenge Rai, the state broadcaster.
Questo che noi stiamo facendo dopo anni di guerreggiata è forse soltanto un primo stadio di un movimento necessario verso la formazione di un polo privato nella televisione commerciale che si possa contrapporre efficacemente al polo pubblico.
It was a television revolution. Mr. Berlusconi, as rich as Croesus now, provided the adverts for his own TV channels, and he had a sharp nose for what the consumer wanted, and Rai's audiences began to plunge.
Public television in Italy has always been lottizzato. It's always been divided between the political parties. It's never built up an independent tradition. And that's meant that when his commercial channel, Berlusconi's commercial television, came along, public television merely aped, competed on the same ground, and succumbed in its values and everything to the Berlusconian model.
With commercial TV in his pocket, the tycoon turned to football. Here we have AC Milan in a big match. Berlusconi took them over in 1986, his local team, turning this ailing club into a team of cup winners, investing in new players and a new manager. And when they won again and again, he became a household name. The crowd loved him, he loved their adoration.
Da quello che ha dimostrato con i Milan Club e con tutto, è veramente una persona eccezionale. Dal mio punto di vista questo qua, qualcun altro sarà antipatico per un fattore politico, per me è validissimo.
Berlusconi è stato il Milan, Berlusconi è tutto, una grande voglia di vincere che ha trasmesso a tutti all'interno della squadra e di tutto il mondo dei tifosi.
Club president gets into the act. Silvio Berlusconi, as 12 months ago in Barcelona, is lifted up by a team that he's got together with his millions.
We don't have a royal family, we don't have a star system like the United States, so our business class is something that people look at intensively. And Berlusconi, as a self-made man, was seen as a success history for many Italians.
Years ago, in 1990, the self-made tycoon invited the BBC to peek at his broadcasting empire, and he summed up the Italian view of him rather nicely.
Forse la personificazione di quello che si può chiamare il sogno italiano.
I'm probably the perfect personification of the Italian dream, of the person who, having started on his own, has managed to reach a certain level. This may naturally elicit a certain amount of jealousy in my regards, which is of course only human and understandable.
Our self-made man had climbed to the top of Italy's media pyramid. Hallelujah indeed. But because of Rai's official monopoly of national networking, Berlusconi's TV channels were still only just within the law. He needed friends, one above all Bettino Craxi, Italy's socialist prime minister in the mid-80s. Craxi personally snuffed out attempts to regulate Berlusconi's TV empire.
Berlusconi aveva un rapporto molto stretto con Craxi e le leggi di Craxi hanno favorito l'avvento delle sue televisioni e ha conquistato un successo enorme e è un fenomeno che verrà studiato negli anni.
And how, in 1992, the law, la legge, took on a different meaning in Italy. A small group of magistrates and prosecutors in Milan, appalled at the corruption of the 1980s, launched their so-called clean hands investigations. They uncovered a pattern of fraud in business and politics. Italy's post-war political system was collapsing, creating a vacuum of power in the land. It was the end of an era. Dr. Francesco Saverio Borelli headed those investigations. Despite the savaging he and his colleagues of clean hands have received from Mr. Berlusconi and his political allies, he has no doubts about the justice of what he did.
Ma vede, per il Paese l'operazione Mani Pulite ha avuto anzitutto un'importanza di carattere morale, perché di fronte alla consapevolezza diffusa nel Paese che a vari livelli della pubblica amministrazione esistesse un malcostume, un fenomeno di corruzione, vi era anche la convinzione altrettanto diffusa che la politica per definizione fosse una cosa sporca e che quindi non fosse possibile impegnarsi in una battaglia per ricondurre entro un ambito di legalità la vita politica e la vita amministrativa.
The magistrates disagreed. Their investigations continued. Italy's old political order started to fall apart, and politicians' heads began to roll. Governments in Italy since World War II had been dominated by the Christian Democrats, often in coalitions during the 1980s, and then not always as top dog. Their perceived role, this was the Cold War, was to keep Italy's strong Communist Party at bay.
We don't have any more the Christian Democrats who ruled for 50 years. We don't have any more the Social Democrats. We don't have any more the Socialist Party. We don't have any more the Republicans, the Liberal Party. We don't have. So, and the Communist Party was rebaptized, renamed after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So we had really a revolution, a judicial revolution.
A wave of bombings swept the country, seen then as the work of the Sicilian mafia. Among the targets were ancient Italian treasures, a basilica dating back to the Roman era, and Florence's celebrated Uffizi Gallery was badly hit. This was striking at Italy's heart, and the result was confusion and some fear. The scene was ripe for Berlusconi.
There was a huge crisis of the ruling moderate political parties, those like the Christian Democracy, which had been ruling Italy since the end of the Second World War. A crisis which was made worse by the judicial investigation on political briberies. And there was a huge popular discontent about the old political class.
The biggest head to roll was that of Bettino Craxi, former Prime Minister, Berlusconi's friend and protector. Craxi, seen here leaving court in Milan, was disgraced and later died abroad in self-imposed exile. Craxi's fall helped to determine Berlusconi to jump into politics. And jump he did. He decided to form his own political movement.
My friend Giuliano Urbani went to see him and said, listen, if you don't do anything, the left will win overwhelmingly with the new system, and the country will be in their hands for a very, very long period of time. And in a country that is dominated by a socialist government, you will not be able to operate as a free entrepreneur. And he was convinced by this presentation and decided to do something about it.
His friends said, don't do that, because you don't know what is going to happen. I mean, you have to give up in your perspective of life and enter in a very, very, very filthy world, planet, the planet of politics, especially in Italy. It's bad everywhere, but in Italy particularly.
Giuliano Ferrara was to become a close friend and advisor to Berlusconi in the intervening years. He's the editor of Il Foglio, a pro-Berlusconi newspaper.
Berlusconi is a byproduct of clean hands, as everybody knows. I mean, clean hands had restructured completely, and the fall of the Berlin Wall had restructured completely the political panorama, the institutional panorama, the whole affair, the whole matter.
In early 1994, Berlusconi summoned a posse of trusted friends to his villa outside Milan. The meeting led to the birth of Berlusconi the politician and of a new political movement, a movement designed to provide Italians with a beacon of hope. For Berlusconi and his country, it was a moment of truth.
I went to Arcore, Berlusconi's villa. He was very excited. He said, I want to put on a party. I want to do that. The name is Forza Italia. I said, what a horrible name, it's just soccer. But he was right.
It's a classic football cry. And it had a kind of national, given that the word Italy was in there, a kind of national appeal aimed at really rallying all Italy behind a political project based, centered on a personality.
And Berlusconi kept saying, well, I will fill this void, and did it as he could and as he liked, as a marketing enterprise. Obviously, the product is candidates. The product is Berlusconi himself.
The Italian nation rallied to this master of marketing, who overnight introduced a new brand of politics, exploiting the medium he knew so well, television. It was to play a key role in his 1994 election campaign. Forza Italia indeed. Berlusconi had no roots in the old, tired political class. He was a new brew.
He's a revolutionary. He was a revolutionary in television, in sport, in everything he touched, even in politics.
Possiamo garantire che queste preoccupazioni finiranno, che noi sappiamo come rilanciare l'economia dell'Italia.
He was clear, he spoke to everybody, all Italians, and he said, I will defeat the left-wing list, the old Communist Party. It's easy. I just need allies, and my allies are the Northern League and the Alleanza Nazionale, the former fascist party. And he said, that's it, I will win.
Nessuno in Italia che possa fare questa promessa, che possa fare questa affermazione con più credibilità e con più prestigio di chi la sta facendo in questo momento.
Is semplificator. There is a word in Italian, politichese. Politichese is something that makes opaque what is clear. Berlusconi is a man that makes simple what is opaque.
We were used to complicated political communication based on ideology, great speeches. He communicated in a very simple way. He used political polls to understand the fears and the wishes of their electorate, to understand the issues they were concerned about and the languages they wanted to be spoken with. In a way, it was an Americanized political campaign.
L'Italia è il paese che amo. Qui ho le mie radici, le mie speranze e i miei orizzonti.
Italy was ripe for change. Silvio Berlusconi stepped into a political void, and Italians nationwide lapped up his image of a new Italy on his TV channels, as even his critics conceded.
È la persona a cui tu ti puoi rivolgere, che ti darà sempre una pacca sulle spalle, che ti dirà sempre, signora, i suoi guai si aggiusteranno, che non ti dirà mai, Dio mio che brutta faccia hai, ma ti dirà, la vedo bene, la vedo bella, la vedo ben vestita, la vedo ben pettinata, non si preoccupi, se ha dei problemi verrà che questi problemi verranno risolti. Ha imparato la forza straordinaria dell'ottimismo.
Berlusconi è il grande venditore di aspirapolvere. Berlusconi è il decano, è il dio dei venditori della volpe folletti.
Our salesman put up a bravura performance with all the razzmatazz of brilliant marketing along with that annoyingly catchy tune. We heard it everywhere in Italy that spring.
Che gli italiani abbiano una debolezza per cercare l'uomo di provvidenza. È sempre una debolezza o talvolta può essere un pregio?
Beh, è una debolezza se l'uomo della provvidenza è un dittatore, è un pregio se l'uomo della provvidenza è un democratico al 100%. Voi avete avuto un uomo, anzi una donna della provvidenza che si chiamava signora Thatcher e credo che abbia portato un gran vantaggio al vostro paese.
Ma lei è un uomo della provvidenza?
Ma cosa vuol dire uomo della provvidenza o meno? Vuol dire un uomo che in un certo momento è utile al suo paese. Spero di poter essere utile al mio paese in questo momento.
And victory for Berlusconi it was in March 1994. A brilliantly staged piece of political theatre. In a couple of months he'd invented a party, won an election and stitched together a government coalition. A truly remarkable feat. Mind you, it was victory at a price. Gianfranco Fini and his far-right party were members of the coalition, plus Umberto Bossi, the North Italian xenophobe, with his Northern League. Bossi, always a tricky customer, was to help torpedo the Berlusconi government at the end of that year, a rather iffy coalition.
The first Berlusconi cabinet, in which I was a spokesman for the government, was very brief, short-lived. And, well, that because the establishment reacted very, very badly.
And the law was on the warpath. Milan's magistrates turned on Berlusconi with a vengeance. Antonio Di Pietro became his most famous accuser.
Lo vedeva così favorevolmente che, quando divenne per la prima volta Presidente del Consiglio, propose a me di fare il suo Ministro dell'Interno. E sa perché? Perché fino al maggio 94 le indagini hanno riguardato altri. Dopo hanno riguardato lui, le sue aziende, i suoi amici, i suoi collaboratori.
Prime Minister Berlusconi left the Naples Conference on Organized Crime today to deal with his own criminal investigation. A cruel irony for a man who had promised to clean up politics.
Non ho mai corrotto nessuno.
I've never corrupted anyone, the media tycoon told the nation on one of his own television channels.
For Berlusconi, the law was now his adversary, and he had a point. The investigators had put the new Prime Minister in their sights, not for his political cronyism, the recruiting of Rabbit's friends and relations from Forza Italia as new MPs and senators, but because of his roots as a tycoon in the 70s and 80s, seen as those years of corruption. The legal spotlight was now on him. The investigators, too, turned on his brother Paolo. The magistrates suddenly became Berlusconi's enemy number one. He berated them from the pulpit. An austerity budget he introduced brought people angrily out onto the streets. This has become a bit of a Berlusconi trademark. And his shaky government coalition collapsed. There was brawling in Parliament. And after just 226 days, he was out on his ear. For all that he was a great tycoon, in politics, Berlusconi was a neophyte, and politics, it seems, had defeated him. He is not a man who takes kindly to defeat. Berlusconi and his followers have always blamed the magistrates for the downfall of his first government. But were Milan's magistrates really playing politics, as he alleges?
Il grave errore che ha compiuto la magistratura delegittimandosi è stato proprio quello di non avere agito a tutto campo. Ormai è un dato storico che si è colpito in determinate direzioni politiche e non si è colpito in altre direzioni politiche. Su questo non si può seriamente discutere. Purtroppo questa operazione di selezione aveva dietro di sé un disegno antecedente, e anche questo è provato storicamente, che un settore, l'ossatura della magistratura, si fosse legata ad un determinato settore della politica, quella di sinistra, è un fatto accertato che oggi è ancora vivo e vivace.
Io conducevo, a quel tempo dirigevo la Procura della Repubblica di Milano, quindi era dal mio ufficio, se non personalmente da me, ma dai miei immediati collaboratori, che partivano queste iniziative. E non c'è mai stata una decisione preconcetta di partire in questa o quella direzione.
These now, for the tycoon turned Prime Minister, were years in the political wilderness. But what a wilderness, wealth does have its rewards. It was a time for family and contemplation. Berlusconi was widely written off as a political force, and in the 1996 elections, indeed, he failed in a comeback attempt. But this man never gives up. He's a winner by temperament, and here and there in his many elegant properties, he began seriously to plot his return to power. The magistrates were on his tail now in a very big way, but he'd set about rebuilding his political empire.
Oggi tutto questo.
Berlusconi made two crucial moves. He set about restructuring his huge TV concerns under one highly profitable umbrella, Mediaset.
E nuove idee per la televisione del futuro.
And he buckled down politically to the nitty-gritty. He realized that he had to revamp the movement that he'd tacked together nationwide in 1994.
When Berlusconi lost the elections in '96, when Romano Prodi became prime minister, he realized that the only way to survive for 5 years in opposition was to reorganize Forza Italia, transform it from an electoral committee to a more traditional party. It's now a much more rooted traditional mass parties, which was able to do well at local elections.
The one-time cruise ship crooner chartered his own liner to sail round the country promoting the Forza Italia message, or if you looked skywards you might see it in the clouds.
Forza Italia is nothing. It's just, pieces of the old ruling class, the moderates, and something new coming from Mr. Berlusconi's business. I mean, they love Berlusconi, they know he has much money, they know he is powerful, they know he is the king, and they work for the king.
He is the party, true enough. But Forza Italia was re-groomed with a slick image, and when it came to elections in 2001, Berlusconi was ready. Every house in the land received a copy of this extraordinary publicity brochure, Una storia italiana, an Italian story. It portrays Mr. Berlusconi as the guy next door. He's one of us, was the message. One of us, the guy who made it, the man perhaps who as Italy's leader again could help you make it too. He lived the beautiful life, he understood business, and he offered hope. Many Italians hated his guts, but many more liked both the man and his message. In the run-up to the 2001 elections, he went on TV and signed a contract with the people. It was a crafty gimmick.
Se alla fine del mio mandato non ho raggiunto questi risultati, mi tolgo di mezzo, vado a casa. Per questo è un contratto importante. E allora Maurizio, ti chiedo scusa.
His victory in May 2001 was a landslide. Italians backed Berlusconi in overwhelming numbers. The media tycoon who never surrenders was back in power.
Ma noi continueremo a rispettare le leggi, ne approveremo tante perché dobbiamo rifare anche il nostro Stato per quanto riguarda la sua pubblica amministrazione, per quanto riguarda le sue leggi, per quanto riguarda...
And back in power with all his contradictions. Berlusconi owns most of Italy's commercial television. As Prime Minister, he has state television under his wing, a conflict of interest to this day unresolved. One of his most faithful TV disciples rebuts this charge disarmingly, but does he?
Coloro che dicono che il TG4 è schierato, è troppo schierato, è fazioso ed è portavoce di Berlusconi, il che è assolutamente falso. Qualche volta pubblicamente lui dice Emilio Fede mi vuole bene, Emilio Fede mi ama dal punto di vista politico, a volte esagera, cioè a volte lui mi critica, Emilio non esagerare, ma io sono passionale.
Buonasera a tutti gli amici di Sibario, buon giovedì.
Television is, for the majority of the Italian population, the only cultural input that they have in their lives. They don't read newspapers. And when you have one man who directly controls still the three major commercial channels, and then also has indirectly the three public channels, then we're in deep water in terms of the relationship in a democracy between media and politics.
The conflict of interest is so big that you cannot absolutely regulate it. Mr. Berlusconi has such a big self-esteem that he thinks that he can avoid any kind of regulations. He can promise it and not deliver it. That's because he's a king, not a prime minister. He said, well, what are they saying about conflict of interest? The TV shows on the commercial TV that I own are against me. Everybody's against me. That's, the victimization technique.
His conflict of interest is one thing, his passing of laws to suit Mr. Berlusconi quite another. To protect himself in his war with Italy's judiciary, he's brought in a whole raft of laws, and most recently he's used his big parliamentary majority to make himself immune from prosecution while in office. But not all of his friends are blind.
From the start of his coming back to power, he said to himself, well, what should I do? I have to save myself from this aggression of the judges. And to save myself means to win the trials. In order to win the trials, I can do, because I have a majority in parliament, something that is good for everybody.
Cominciare dalla legge con cui è stata ratificato l'accordo per le rogatorie con la Svizzera, è sopravvenuta la legge sui falsi in bilancio, e poi abbiamo avuto la legge Cerami, quella che ha ampliato le possibilità di spostamento dei processi da una sede all'altra. Quindi, come vede, ci sono ripetuti tentativi a livello politico di predisporre delle norme a favore del Presidente e dei suoi coimputati.
L'anomalia italiana dov'è? Che Berlusconi è anche capo della maggioranza parlamentare e capo del governo. E allora, giacché è sotto processo per falsi in bilancio e per corruzione, ha fatto delle leggi in cui ha derubricato, cioè il falso in bilancio non è più reato. Lui è come se aveva una camicia in cui doveva dimostrare che non era sporca e pulita, ha fatto una legge per dire: dichiaro che quel grado di sporco è uguale a pulito.
Il gruppo popolare che si batte per non dare via libera all'Europa della sinistra, alla loro concezione di uno Stato autoritario, di uno Stato invadente, di uno Stato che interviene nell'economia.
His idea of liberty is negative freedom, freedom from interference, and not a great deal of positive freedom at all, i.e. individual realization through each of us sacrificing something in a collective interest with collective rules. His is an idea, a classic negative freedom from interference, and time and again he's gone to the microphone to say this. We don't want the state to put its nose into our business. We want to be left free in the market, in our personal lives, as far as the judicial system is going.
A genuine surprise back in 2002 was to witness Berlusconi's failure to woo his own kind, senior industrialists, at a big conference in Parma. His is a pro-business government, long on promises but short on achievement. He clearly, though, had hoped for their backing.
Questa è la politica estera che si doveva fare, che intendiamo fare e che faremo.
Not a bit of it. He spoke for almost an hour. The reception was distinctly muted. Big business has yet to see him deliver.
Il discorso di Berlusconi è un discorso abbastanza pragmatico, ma sostanzialmente sulle difensive. Cercava di portare avanti un ragionamento che era legato a quello che è stato fatto in questi ultimi mesi. Delle cose sulle quali probabilmente c'è ancora aspettativa, forte aspettativa da parte degli imprenditori. Tutti sanno molto bene che gli elementi, i risultati non sono ancora arrivati.
Personalmente sono molto critico nei confronti di Silvio Berlusconi perché trovo sia un po' troppo così autoreferenziato, abbia un ego smisurato e chi fa impresa è abituato, come dire, a basarsi meno sui sogni e più sul proseguio giorno per giorno delle cose.
The tycoon was plainly ill at ease. The businessmen wanted Thatcherite reforms. Berlusconi's legislation so far could have been designed by his own lawyers, coincidentally or not, for a man facing trial for allegedly bribing judges. And Mr. Berlusconi has antagonised Italy's trades unions. He thinks they're all communists anyway, like judges and prosecutors. This was Rome in a general strike, ironically brought on by a very modest employment reform. But current proposals for pension reform have again put the unions on the warpath.
This man is trying to do, humbly, what your Margaret Thatcher did 20 and more years ago. And she came to a real confrontation, as you know, with the unions. But it had to happen.
Thatcher!
Many economists agree that Italy's labour laws, tax and pension systems are in need of an overhaul. But Mr. Berlusconi's achievement so far has been to unite a dispirited and divided centre-left opposition.
Non mi faccio esprimere perché poi potrei essere troppo scortese nei suoi confronti e non ne va della mia educazione.
È del tutto sbagliato, non si può trarre profitto solo dal togliere i diritti ai lavoratori, bisogna fare discorsi più seri.
Since then, little has changed. Italy's centre-left is still looking for a leader to pull together its different parties. Silvio Berlusconi remains perhaps a unifying hate figure. And as a Prime Minister who's done nothing in 9 years seriously to resolve his own conflicts of interest, he's an easy target. Rallying the country's once powerful unions to battle may be Napoleonic, but it does seem counterproductive.
Berlusconi gliel'ha restituita con una bacchetta magica, ha rimesso i sindacati al centro del dibattito politico italiano, dove non erano più. Perché? Perché i sindacati sono diventati, in qualche modo, agli occhi di molti italiani, come i difensori di un sistema generale di diritti della parte più debole della popolazione, di diritti del mondo del lavoro, ma di diritti che in qualche modo riguardano tutti.
During an official visit to Bulgaria recently, he criticised 3 Italian TV performers, 2 of them journalists. It was blistering. But why vent his wrath in Sofia? His timing was bizarre.
L'uso che Viaggi, come si chiama quell'altro, Santoro, ma l'altro, gli Tassi hanno fatto della televisione pubblica pagata con i soldi di tutti è un uso criminoso. E io credo che sia un preciso dovere da parte della nuova dirigenza di non permettere più che questo avvenga.
Non è incredibile? Bin Laden può andare in video e io no. Ma di cosa hanno paura?
Luttazzi was one of the trio. All had shows on state television and had allowed Berlusconi to be rubbished during the election period, so he did have a point. All 3 say they've been dropped. Luttazzi now does theatre shows and says Berlusconi is suing him.
5 miliardi me li chiede Fininvest, sono le cose separate che non devono riscuotere. 11 miliardi me li chiede Forza Italia, in totale vogliono 41 miliardi più o meno da me. Non ce li ho, non sono un idraulico, quindi si possono mettere il cuore in pace. Ora questa è fisicamente la citazione, vedete qui c'è la firma di Silvio Berlusconi, vedete questa è la firma di Silvio Berlusconi. Ridete.
It's Mr. Berlusconi's use of power that grates. In June, the editor of Corriere della Sera, Italy's most prestigious newspaper, suddenly resigned, saying he was tired. Many thought he'd been pushed thanks to Berlusconi. The editor has no illusions about his Prime Minister's dislike of independent journalism.
I giornalisti buoni sono coloro che lo capiscono, che lo apprezzano, che lo seguono e che fanno parte del suo entourage. Non è comprensibile che gli altri fanno il loro mestiere e siano considerati dei nemici, comunisti. Il giornalismo indipendente è per sua natura urticante, indispone, è scomodo, così come scomoda è stata la BBC per Blair.
But Mr. Berlusconi's true hate is the judiciary. In a Milan court in June, he defended himself against bribery charges going back to the purchase of SME, a state-owned food group in the 80s. His was an uneasy smile. A few months earlier, his principal lawyer, Cesare Previti, was sentenced to 11 years in jail in another case involving bribery of judges linked to Berlusconi's Fininvest Corporation. The Prime Minister defended himself vehemently, arguing that he was the victim of persecution by Italy's judges.
Mi aspettavo dal Premier un gesto di statista. Mi aspettavo che non scendesse a queste bassezze, cioè non usasse questi termini, perché un paese che tende a delegittimare la magistratura è un paese che scivola nel baratro della barbarie istituzionale.
Una prova, un'accusa, una testimonianza, un documento e non c'è la motivazione.
And lo and behold, just days before he was due to return to court to testify under oath, Italy's parliament granted him immunity from prosecution.
Ultimamente, negli ultimi mesi, si ricominciano a leggere nei giornali notizie di indagini, di inchieste, di scandali, di persone arrestate in questa o quella località, quindi credo che stia riprendendo un certo andazzo la corruzione. E certamente l'atteggiamento del governo Berlusconi e di Silvio Berlusconi verso la magistratura in generale è un atteggiamento che incoraggia tutti coloro che della magistratura e dell'attività della magistratura dovrebbero avere paura, perché screditare e quindi indebolire di fronte all'opinione pubblica il potere giudiziario significa dare forza e dare incoraggiamento a tutti quelli che vogliono violare la legge.
A quelling thought indeed. Recently, he had a mausoleum built in his home near Milan. Plainly, like many a leader, he has his mind on history.
He wants to do something so he can be remembered. He doesn't care about his financial interest. He's already disgustingly rich. I mean, he is 10 or $15 billion worth, so he doesn't need more money. He wants to be remembered, so he will try his best to do what he can while in government.
Mind you, Berlusconi is not planning to move into his mausoleum anytime soon, or indeed to retire from politics. He fights on.
Lots of people say that Berlusconi has no economic project. They also say he hasn't got much of a political project. I'm a bit more dubious there. I think he does have a political project. What he'd like to do, he's in his mid-60s now, is win the next elections in 2006. From that position of power in his second term, reform the constitution and go for a much strengthened presidency, say on the French model, and he would become the first strong president of the Italian Republic. So I think that's where we're going, towards a presidential republic, if he wins in 2006.
A man never to be underestimated. What jars still are his contradictions. Only too often he is seen to be acting in his own interests rather than those of his country.